We did define education in terms of the way that the author Kevin defines it, and he defined education as the preparation of a child intellectually, emotionally, spiritually, and physically for life and eternity. So this is our foundation for moving forward. So today we're going to try to cover 3 more principles. We'll see how far we get for education. So the second one here is quality one-on-one instruction. So, I've been reading a few books on teaching recently, and a couple of the books recommend the reader to ask themselves this question. Can you think of one person that invested in you in the past that made a big impact in your life today? You know, was there somebody you can think of that that encouraged you to be the best you could be, or inspired you to work really hard to accomplish something? I have a little exercise on that if we wrap up early, I might pass out this little worksheet, but I'm going to keep going at this point. So keep that question in the back of your mind. I mean, I guess the idea of that question is that if you can think of that person, and then you can think, okay, why, what was it about this person that inspired me or caused me to work real hard to do my best, then as we teach our students, we may be able to implement some of those things in our classrooms or our homes. So Kevin goes on to say that real progress in education and training will generally come one child at a time through the investment, there's that investment word again, of time, energy, intellect, and emotion in one-on-one situations. So that's starting out here. We understand that throughout history, mentorship and one-on-one tutoring works. So this was the optimum form of education chosen by kings for their sons. And I was thankful for our church service today. There was several tie-ins to Sunday school, one of which was Deuteronomy. We read Deuteronomy 6, and right there it talks about teaching these things to your sons, to your children. So that certainly is one reference in the Bible that talks about one-on-one tutoring. Also in Exodus, I think when the children ask their parents, about their history, they can recite, that story. Luke and John, I believe that, Jesus used one-on-one situations pretty significantly in his ministry. And of course the Proverbs, pretty much most of the book is, a father to a son kind of a situation. So besides the Bible, there's also many examples in secular history of tutoring and mentoring. I've recently been learning about a guy named George Wythe, who was one of the signers. I looked him up in my my history book here on the signers of the Declaration, and he's listed in here, and there's a little line about his efforts to tutor primarily Thomas Jefferson. And just a little line here, it says, Thomas Jefferson studied law under him and had great admiration for Wythe. Other prominent men who studied under him were John Marshall and Henry Clay. And there's a quote that says, Wythe sometimes paid for the schooling of needy law students and took them into his home to live. Thomas Jefferson, who had lost his father when he was just 14, called Wythe my second father. So that's just one example from history of one-on-one instruction. Can you guys think of any other examples from history where this one-on-one approach was used? Go on.
Keller, Andy Sullivan, made me just think about the relationship there with, the blind deaf woman. How she ended up being able to function in life was because of one-on-one instruction. So, other historical.
The first thing I thought of was Abraham and Isaac when they went up, to the mountain to make the sacrifice. Eventually they went by themselves the rest of the way then.
All right, okay.
I still remember reading about Thomas Edison way back when we were considering the whole homeschool thing, and it was, really a new thing, and realizing that apparently Thomas Edison was, whatever his issue was, I think we'd say he had ADD today, because his teacher called him addle, and concluded that he was incapable of learning. And his mother then said, well, you can't teach him, I will. And so his mother, Thomas Edison's mother, actually became his teacher. And, everybody knows the name Thomas Edison, but it was really interesting that he was declared unable to learn and then had to be tutored one-on-one in order to, the type of learner he apparently was, had to be tutored.
Let's see here. Maybe I'll skip that next line.
So when we think of tutoring, Kevin points out here that there's different times to employ this tutorial approach. And he says, with introducing new material, and he points out that each child learns at a different rate and requires repetition, either in the form of verbal reminders or exercises in different areas. So there would be one time to employ this one-on-one approach. Also, when a student is struggling, he says, in the course of a student's study, he may find himself getting stuck in a certain area. Unless a tutor is there at a specific point at which he needs help, frustration will set in. Either the student will ignore the problem and move on to his own detriment, or he will quit. And a third place to employ the one-on-one approach is when teaching major life lessons, especially in the area of character. Kevin says, in the early years, a child will not be able to discipline himself to do the things that require effort and push his own comfort zone. A mentor who properly understands the child and his potential must motivate by positive or negative reinforcement to train those character traits of diligence, patience, and courage into that child. So I know I've seen at least a couple of those, especially that last one in my experience. You guys have any comments on that?
Or a question, is Swanson recommending tutors for the character, or is he recommending that the parents tutor their children? I mean, the building of character is more often done in the home, I think. I think of it more often as being a home effort than being a tutorial effort, an outside tutor. Is he making a recommendation for tutors?
I think that he would say, I'm just thinking about all the learning I find from Kevin. I think he might be talking about, maybe in this context, parents being the primarily the tutors in this context as far as character, but there would be other times where, we wouldn't have everything that maybe one of our kids needs. And in which case, it might be wise to pair them up with another mentor that may have that, skill or that strength.
So something that we as parents would have to be very careful of who we entrust our children to for that kind of tutoring.
Yeah, I think in the big picture, he's trying to make a point that a one-on-one interaction is more efficient than if a child, if there was 20 children, in the classroom, let's say. I think it's the point he's trying to make.
Okay.
I just have a comment. It's kind of the same thing when it comes to our Christian walk. I can think of Joel spending weeks at the Panda Buffet in New Holland trying to drill a post-millennial viewpoint into my head. But he was introducing new material, and I was struggling with it, and it was major life lessons. But it was part of the Christian walk, and Joel took the time and did that. He took a tutorial approach and mentored me through it. And I'm very thankful to this day that he took the time. But that's the type of work that he did. And it's just more a comment than anything. It is, to me, it's very important.
And that was an introduction of new material.
It was an introduction of new material.
Yeah.
Yeah. This whole idea of mentoring, I mean, it's a lifelong work for all of us as we, I know that you involved in mentoring a lot of women, right? So, I mean, we're all doing this all day, every day with our children, with our peers at work. So, yeah, thanks for that. Gives us a little bigger perspective on this.
I think too, the thing that occurred to me, very different, was that there were times when, we only homeschooled for a few years, and Bing is the math guy, in case anybody wondered about that. And if my kids, he would introduce the new material in an evening before, and they would have an assignment the next day to work through. And if somebody got stuck and it was frustrating for them, I could say, okay, well, you don't want me to try to explain this to you, so just put that down now, move to the next thing, and Dad will get to it when he gets home. And then he would. And that may be the other side of this, is knowing what you're good at and what you can do, and being willing to say, we need somebody else to do this thing, whatever that is. If you've got two parents who are homeschooling with, it might even be true if you're in a Christian school. If your child is struggling with a subject that you two can't really do the tutoring, then maybe to be willing to look for that outside tutor would be, I could wait in-house, but maybe somebody would have to wait for somebody else and hire somebody to do that. Recognizing the need and your own limits.
Right. But on character,
Yeah.
you would jump all
I
over it.
wouldn't want anybody, yeah, right. Maybe even in, okay, not English.
All right, so
You laughing at Shirley?
so the goal here, and maybe some of the older parents can speak to this better than us, but the goal in education is to see increasing levels of independence in the students as he learns how to learn. It's the idea that this one-on-one time should steadily decrease over time as our students are able to study independently for most of the day. And Kevin points out that an important part of one-on-one tutoring is to avoid giving the answer to a question. The student can be shown how to find the answer himself. This can be done by asking him leading questions and directing him to certain tools or materials. So I would think, Joel, that you would come to mind. I mean, you're probably a mentor to a lot of us, like Dave said, and you ask a lot of questions and direct us to resources. I mean, we're reading the book, the hero's book, so that's a good model. I mean, for us to use, with our students or whatever setting. I mean, maybe your employees, Dave, as far as the discipline book, you have people reading that book, maybe, So I know for me, I'm not good at asking leading questions because I always want to give the answer. Maybe I'm not patient, so this takes, when you say it takes patience to, ask a question, but then let that other person, you know the answer, but, let that other person, just kind of, and it might take a day, it might take a week, it might take a year, and the whole time you just got to kind of be patient with that. So I would say that's a real skill that I don't know if I have yet. But, yeah.
There's that old saying about leading a horse to water and not being able to make him drink. One of the most important things we can do for the kids is instill in them a sense of curiosity. I can still remember getting excited about something in maybe history or even math, whatever it might be as we were teaching, and getting the blank glazed stare. And I would say to the kids, aren't you curious about this? And they would say, no, Dad, I'm not. But as it turns out, by asking the question over and over and over, aren't you curious about this, that they eventually became curious about different things, maybe in a different way than I was curious about, but eventually they became curious enough because, as it says on your slide, you're teaching them to learn how to learn. They have to want to learn. It's even more important. They need that motivation first. So for whatever that's worth, whatever we can do by asking leading questions, by pushing a little bit, is to pique their curiosity as much as possible, is an important aspect of what we're doing.
Maybe you've already addressed this, or you're going to get to it. How do you distinguish them between asking children leading questions that'll lead them to the answer, and sometimes they actually don't know the answer? Or like, maybe you've looked at the material once, they just haven't retained it. I mean, I see even within my own children, some of my kids will just hold on to information a lot longer than others. And so how do you know when you're actually driving them to frustration because they don't know the answer and they are really struggling to give, because especially when you're dealing with your kids, they want to please you and they want to give you that answer and they want you to be proud of them for knowing the answer, and sometimes they don't. What do we use to distinguish that between, we're asking leading questions that maybe they're just being kind of lazy about and don't answer, and knowing when we're asking leading questions and they just really don't know the answers? I mean, I don't know, maybe you address it.
Are you going to address that?
Yeah, I'll address that. They probably learn in a different style. So instead of lecture, maybe, use a different style to teach it to them. Probably not grasping what you're saying for the teacher. Maybe they're technologies. And then we're doing the notes, it's reading the lecture. But I do want to say also on number one, the goal of Christian education, when we're going to the step of number two, I think it's really important to give the kids a biblical worldview foundation before you let them get to step number two, so when they're reading or whatever they're studying, they're able to make correct conclusions in their critical thinking. I think that's a really important step on number one. If they don't have a correct biblical worldview, they may not come to the conclusions that they should in step number two.
Well, and just as a follow-up, like I hear that, and I say yes and amen to that, especially as understanding that they learn differently, but to that very point, if I'm trying to lay the foundation of a biblical worldview through which they can actually come to correct conclusion, that's where I'm saying sometimes there's not always, at least I haven't found, I'm totally open to how to do it, there's not always different ways for me to give them certain theologies. Like some of it is just a matter of, they're going to have to learn this, you know what I mean? Like I try to spin it in different ways that the kids can take hold of. I think that's where it's hard for me. Sometimes I struggle with, I'll just keep asking the questions, and my dear wife will be like, honey, he doesn't maybe. Like, you're frustrated because you're asking him these questions, and yeah, maybe these two got it, but this one hasn't yet retained that to be able to come to the conclusion. That's where I guess I struggle, just not always knowing, how to do that. Trying to.
Yeah, your kids are young. Your kids are young.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. But
So I was going to close this principle with a quote here that kind of speaks to what you're asking, I think. So it's a little bit long, but it says, since learning is essentially a process of discovery, the teacher's art consists largely in devices whereby one individual can help another to lift himself up from a state of knowing and understanding less to knowing and understanding more. Left to his own devices, the learner would not get very far unless he asked himself questions, perceived problems to be solved, suffered puzzlement over dilemmas, put himself under the necessity of following out the implications of this hypothesis or that, made observations and weighted the evidence for alternative hypotheses. So might be kind of what you're saying. I mean, you might need to pose a question at the level that your kids are, and, you know, let them follow that out, you know, and maybe put it on the shelf for a couple days, and maybe they'll come back and, you know, hey, I tried that, it didn't work. Well, I'll try this, you know. So kind of gets into the idea. This is something that I just recently came across that, I mean, I think when I first started going to homeschool, I thought, hey, I have all the answers and all I have to do is, eventually I'm going to tell my kids everything and then they're going to be smart. But I've just kind of come to realize that you know, I really can't teach them anything. I mean, I have to just, what do you say, I have to encourage them to want to learn. And so since they all, we'll get into the fact that they all learn differently later. So, I mean, they talk about a teacher's art. Would you say that teaching is an art?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I never thought of myself as an artist, so I have to like change my thought process here. But so maybe we can keep moving. It also is a good lead-in. You were talking about biblical worldview and as one of the goals. So I don't want to take too much time, but so the third secret here is the principle of protection. Let me read you just a couple clips. So just to introduce a little bit of the perspective of this author, Kevin, when it comes to this next principle of protection. He starts this chapter out with a little story. And basically, he was raised on an island in Japan, Kevin was. So basically just summarizing, he was born in the States, but and his dad taught in schools, but at some point his dad decided that he did not want to raise his children in this culture, so he set out to make his own culture for his family on an island out in the Pacific Ocean. So he basically took his family, moved them to an island in the Pacific. So he says, you know, books in his house were scoured and edited, sometimes with black markers. The only American movie he remembers watching during his teenage years was The Sound of Music. But somewhere around a semi-romantic scene, I am 16 going on 17, television went off and they were all sent to bed. So that's a little perspective there. But then Kevin says, returning stateside in 1981, he enrolled in a prominent West Coast public university majoring in mechanical engineering. And after several years, he was elected student body president at a university of 17,000 students. So he says, I have reflected on this unusual upbringing and the immediate success I enjoyed following those early years. And he goes on to describe there were 6 children in his family, and all of them, you know, ended up having a clear sense of purpose in life. They all are fulfilling a part of the vision that their parents had for them, and they're all serving God in some capacity around the world. So he asked himself, how could so much sheltering produce such balance? So he says that this principle of protection, so protection is not enough. You know, and another word for protection he uses would be sheltering, which probably has a little bit of a bad reputation. But he says, you know, protection is not enough. His parents provided us with a highly unusual degree of protection. Their overriding operational purpose was preparation. So his perspective on this next secret is, while we need to protect our children, we also need to prepare them. Moving on in the book, he quotes Matthew 18:6 here. So first we could talk about protection. So, you know, Matthew 18:6, you know, says, whoever causes the downfall of one of these little ones, it'd be better if a heavy millstone were hung around his neck. Since we defined education as the preparation of a child intellectually, emotionally, spiritually, and physically for life and eternity, then it would mean that a child needs to be protected intellectually, emotionally, spiritually, and physically. So you guys all with me at this point? All right. So he goes on to talk about principles of protection. He says no one's ever completely immune to the damage caused by bad influences. I can think of influences I had when I was younger that I wish I didn't, and still mess with me today. And he points out that the degree of protection required by a child will decrease over time as the child becomes increasingly grounded in the truth. And then lastly, every child is an individual, and therefore some will require more protection than others. And I can certainly see that in our kids at this point. So you guys have any comments on that, or questions?
I think it's really important to understand that the protection includes the preparation. It's vital. There are times when I cringe when I hear that a couple has pulled their kids out of public school to homeschool them because they're going to protect them. And what they're going to do is they're going to shelter them in the sense that you said that sometimes that sheltering is a bad thing. They're not going to prepare them, they're just going to shelter them. And so the preparation is so vital. It's so important as an aspect of this protection. I applaud him for bringing that to the forefront.
Going off of that, coming from my background.
Yep.
From the Amish Anabaptist background, we were so sheltered that we weren't, that when the day did come that we would, start going to movie theaters, doing whatever, we went from, it was like a bungee cord. We went from one end of the spectrum, or I at least did. I went from one end of the spectrum where I was this sheltered kid to a year later doing cocaine.
Because you were protected but not prepared.
I was not prepared whatsoever.
I second Dave's experience. Mine was similar. My parents very much protected us, but they didn't really prepare us. It was kind of like this attitude of, well, sin is bad, just stay away from that. There wasn't very much like, here's how you confront sin. And my parents wanted me to be protected because they felt it was what was good for me. Like, I don't want to assume upon their motives bad things. Their motives were good. But when you look at things like Proverbs and you look at Scripture, Proverbs does not mince any words in telling the son, this is what how does it refer to the woman? It talks about that woman who's dangerous, and it discusses what she's like and how you need to avoid and what you need to do. Proverbs isn't careful with words in a way that hides the truth. Proverbs comes right out, says it, explains it, and tells you what you're supposed to do about it. So if there's protection without preparation, what you're really doing is harming your children in the long run. Because you're setting them up for, as soon as those protections are gone, it's
Rebellion.
yeah.
Yeah, it is.
Definitely echo that as well. And it's really important, and I'm watching our older kids kind of play this out now that we kind of have to into the spectrum. But having them, they need to own it. Our kids, you can put the protections in place, the sheltering in place, whatever. But if your children don't own what you believe about media, what you believe about video games, what you believe about books, what you believe about what's your worldview, if they don't own that, the minute that they don't have to be under your shelter protection, just like Dave said, you're the bungee cord, you're just gonna, and we've watched homeschool child after homeschool child after homeschool child just literally do that. And I think that just knowing that, Connor moves in Uganda and he sent me a text asking about a specific movie, and kind of was on the fence about whether you should watch it or not. And we've encouraged our kids, from day one, it's looking at, movie guides, movie reviews, trying to get it, ascertain the benefit and, what's going on in these things. And I was just so thankful that he was asking for our wisdom, for Tim and our wisdom. But ultimately, I put it back and said, I'm looking at this, I feel like you go either way, and if you start it, you can just stop watching it if it's not appropriate, or you find that, it's different than what the review said. But thankful that, the relationship's there, and that, so we're not, he's not making these decisions and hiding things behind our back or whatever. It's right out there, like, this is what I'm struggling with. If it said, no, don't watch it, he wouldn't have watched it. And here he's in Uganda, we wouldn't have known if he did, but he would have chosen not to. But yet, we were teaching him and preparing him to help make his own decisions and to make wise choices. And, so I think that's really important.
Yeah, just a dog pile on. That's exactly, my background with being homeschooled or an evangelical home, which was always just like shelter. But here's one of the things that I think, goes back to the idea of preparation. For me, and many of you know my parents, I'm not questioning the intent of my parents, but I continually heard over and over again, our rules are this, our rules are this, our rules are this, our rules are this. And the only thing that communicated to me is I can't wait till I'm 18, because then I get to make my own rules. And what was not instilled in me was the biblical worldview that says there's only one set of rules, God's. And they're God's rules, and they need to be God's rules in the home as well. And so that when the child comes to the point of, am I going to break this rule or not? It's no longer, am I going to disobey my parents or just do what I want to do? It's, am I going to break God's law or not? And I think that's the area that we all really, I would think, need to just continue to sharpen as parents. Is, I try to be mindful of that too when I'm disciplining my children. Is it simply, I'm doing this because you broke my rules? Well, by what authority do I make rules? And what are my rules based on? Should mine be any different than God's rules? And I would argue no, of course, but it's that preparation of God's law needs to be the standard. And that, to go against it is not to just go against your parents' will, but is to actually go against God's very law. Because otherwise I think we communicate the idea, and I think many of us have been there, I can't wait till I'm 18 and out on my own, because then I can make my own rules. As if we have that sort of authority, so.
Yeah, that was a big thing. I don't know if I've mentioned this before or not. I might have, growing up from my own father. When we were young, it was like, hey, this is the way it is. And we get older, we'd ask him why, and then he would do his best to explain that his rules were actually connected to the Bible, right? And so, okay, that's pretty powerful. Who am I, a 7-year-old kid, argue with the Bible, right? But then we got older, and we discuss it with my father, early teens. Why we have this rule? Because the Bible says this, right? As we got older, then we discussed with I still remember discussing with my dad, well, okay, the Bible says that, but what about this over here? And we get into this discussion with my father what the Bible actually said, right? And he was so committed to what the Bible said rather than his own rules that there were many occasions where my brothers and I would be able to talk him out of his rule if we could make the biblical case that his rule was not actually biblical. And he would then back off, after the discussion, okay, yeah, you go, yeah, I see what you're saying, you go do that. And I think for some parents, maybe that'd be like, oh man, you're giving up all this control. It was opposite for us. It was like, hey, my dad really does believe this. And that was he really taught us that the Bible was to be obeyed by his own response to it as it related to us.
What a great way to get your kids to read the Bible.
Yeah. And pay attention to church even, right?
Wow.
It was strong for us.
Just add one thing to the protection principle is, rules for the sake of rules are tough, because I was talking to somebody in between church and church about consequences. Like, so what's the why is this rule in place? And, what's the consequence of this rule? And or of God's law, or whatever it is, why did God create this commandment, honor your father and mother? Well, because it will go well with you. If you don't, then it won't go well with you. So there's a consequence of those. So it's just kind of talking about the rule isn't always quite enough. So just thinking, adding the consequence and what it means and what happens if you obey or disobey this particular rule. What's the consequence?
I have one comment to add to that, Tim. Here's where the thing comes in for parents. Don't make rules that aren't biblical,
Absolutely.
because that's what happened in my life.
Yeah.
They weren't necessarily a biblical aspect, so it didn't go well with me for many years.
Although there's always going to be rules in a home, right? Every home has rules, and
But they still come from a biblical perspective, right?
absolutely, sure.
Do you have a comment?
I was just going to say, I think that's where the purpose of protection and shielding comes from. Protection would be biblical, well, rules that, like Seth was talking about, you're being taught, and the whole saying, you're taught in the home because we're protecting our children. But shielding is just saying, no, we're not doing that, we're not going here, you're not watching that, you're not doing this. It's different.
I think undergirding a lot of this is there needs to be a trust between the parent and the child.
Yep.
I mean, the child really needs to feel like you have their best interest at heart within the constructs of the Bible's directives. Because otherwise, when you were saying when your children got older, they would call and they would ask your opinion on things. Children aren't going to do that if they don't trust that. You can objectively guide them.
And I think, Joel kind of alluded to it, but admit when you're wrong too. Man, parenting is tough work. Sometimes you gotta admit that you're wrong. Like, you know what, I was wrong here, and I see your point, and yeah.
And again, if you do that, and ask my children, they can tell you, I've done it, but if you go back to, here's why daddy was wrong.
Right.
Because the Bible says this, and I did not do that, and I am sorry, will you forgive me? Again, it's not just, okay, say you're sorry when you're wrong. It's, hey, I'm sorry because I broke God's law, and it shows again that submission to, dad doesn't make rules. He's got two choices, he either obeys God's or he follows after his own. And it's just enforcing that to go back and say, I was wrong. The way that daddy knows he was wrong is because God's word says this. And I didn't do that.
Ultimately, there's like two possible approaches to narrow it down. There's the external control approach. I'm going to control my child's behavior and my child's experiences versus an internal approach. I'm going to address my child's heart. I'm going to address my own heart. I'm going to deal with the law of God and how it relates to our heart attitudes. So like if you're dealing with their heart and if you're dealing with their internal responses and addressing those in light of God's word, as opposed to dealing with their external responses, then you're getting at you're putting an axe to that root of the sin in your child's life versus simply covering it over with something that looks nice from the exterior. I think that's a very important realization to understand, what is your motivation as a parent? Is it to have a right heart before God and to teach your children to have a right heart before God? Or is it to have an external control? Which, external controls are good, but external controls serve that teaching their heart. They don't do it on their own.
I think to Jen's point, and Joel spoke to it as well, that to have that relationship with your child, they have to be able to ask the questions to you. They have to be able to say, why do we have this rule? Why do I have to follow this thing? And you have to be willing to say, you need to ask that question respectfully, but they have to be able to ask that question. You can't say, well, I'm the parent and that's the rule, and the Bible says it. You have to be willing to say, you need to word that differently, you need to speak with respect, but you do need to be able to say, well, let's sit down and look, God's word says this, and that's why we have this rule and have those conversations. You can't be so authoritarian, like this is the rule because God says it and that's the end of the discussion. That trust doesn't come that way, that you have to have those conversations.
Conrad?
I was thinking about what I remember from the way my parents did it. And I can remember having family discussions about, okay, so should we just turn off the internet? Or should we, how should we handle this? Because there's a lot of bad stuff just one click away. So the policy they always followed was, we're going to punish the crime, we're not going to try to prevent it. And this, or in the sense that we're not going to try to build all these walls like the Pharisees did around obedience so we never break the rules. But rather, if we break the rules, we know what the consequences are.
So, yeah, thanks for all your input. You guys, a lot of people mentioned the need for a relationship, and Kevin's going to get to that in the fifth. Let's see here. Yeah, the fifth secret is rooting in relationships. So that's coming here on the horizon. So maybe before we leave the protection side and go to the preparation side, I just put this one slide in here. I have one of my cousins who grew up in a large homeschool family who grappled with this. One time he told me that to look at your children kind of like a kite, like you let the string out slowly, and he said, if you try to hold on to that string too hard, at some point, the string would snap, and I mean, I was coming from a son's perspective on his upbringing, and so that word picture always stayed in my mind, and I've just come back to that multiple times. So I think it kind of demonstrates what a lot of you guys had said here. So, well, I guess, let's see, I guess we're still on protection here. Yeah, Kevin just says somehow, in terms of how much we have to protect, Kevin just says, somehow, we have to gauge the level of protection necessary for each child. So, Conrad, I mean, maybe, if there was a lot of self-control, maybe keeping the internet on, for you guys worked. I mean, there might be a child that really struggled, in a certain area, maybe for that child, that was not enough protection, so it just seems like these things are so individual differences. But Kevin points out, a way we can think about, how do we gauge this is with this verse here in 2 Corinthians, talking about that the weapons of our warfare are not fleshy, but powerful through demolition of strongholds. We demolish arguments, every high-minded thing that's raised up against the knowledge of God, and taking every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. So he says that the acid test in determining whether or not a child is ready to be subjected to an environment hostile to his or her worldview, is this. The child must be prepared to confront the world, to wrestle with the principalities and powers, to cast down imaginations that oppose the knowledge of God, and bring every thought captive to Christ. So that's what I was thinking earlier, Joel, in the sermon, in terms of these ideas and these philosophies. Like this next slide, like he talks about these, imaginations or philosophies include, egalitarianism, evolution, relativism, I mean, I had to stop and check, hey, do I even know what some of these were? I think I could roughly define all these, but, just the idea that, going back to this slide, like, if our children aren't prepared to understand these philosophies and, be able to counter them from a biblical perspective, then maybe that would be the determining factor as to, maybe they're not ready to be exposed to this movie or this book, because it contains one of these philosophies. I just thought that was a good way to kind of a framework to think through some of these things because they are so individual for each child. And just thankful for this church and, you know, Mars. I mean, we're really educated here on a lot of these things, you know, so we're equipped and prepared, you know, I think between church and, you know, Kevin's radio show, I listen to that, and other resources that can, we as mentors can know what these things mean so that we can then discuss them and interact with them, you know, with our children or those that we're mentoring. So, yeah, so that is the end of the protection. The next slide moves into the preparation. It's 12 o'clock. One resource I can mention that I've come across when this is, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Philip Telfer, the Media Talk 101. He made that movie called Captivated. But he produces resources, so he just has this, you know, Christianity and entertainment guide, it's a workbook, but he has like a media discernment checklist. So like we'd use that, it's like, okay, fine, if we're gonna watch this movie, we're gonna print this checklist out, and then it's like, each time somebody, you know, blasphemes, or, you know, takes the Lord's name in vain, or, you know, fornicate, or whatever, like, maybe not fornication, but, the idea is to be able to discern these things and then discuss them, you know. So, you know, there are sources out there that can help us to work through some of these things, because like you said, you can't just build a fence and say no to everything, you know. So if we're going to engage, you know, Kevin always says, if we're going to engage the culture, you know, then we're going to be part of the culture. We're going to see movies. We're going to let our kids read books. But then we have to be prepared to, you know, discuss these things, like what your father did. So yeah, just want to encourage you guys. It's really easy to teach Sunday school here because all you have to do is like bring up any topic and everybody talks. I only got through like half of my presentation here.
You can tell us to be quiet anytime you want to.
No, I want feedback. So I guess next time we'll finish up the protection in terms of talking about preparation and how we can move on.
Okay.
So.